The thunder of artillery had finally ceased, but Klaus Müller's ears still rang as he stumbled through the muddy French countryside in May 1945. Around him, thousands of German soldiers walked in stunned silence, their once proud Wehrmacht uniforms now tattered and stained. The war was over and they were prisoners. Klaus had been a machine gunner in the 21st Panzer Division, defending the crumbling Atlantic Wall when American forces broke through. At 23, he had spent the last 4 years believing in the invincibility of the Third Reich. Now, as GIs herded him and his comrades into hastily constructed camps, that world had shattered completely. The American soldiers were nothing like the propaganda had described. They chewed gum, shared cigarettes, and some even spoke broken German with surprising kindness. When Klaus first saw a black American sergeant directing operations, he stared in bewilderment. Years of Nazi racial ideology had not prepared him for this reality. Within days, Klaus found himself on a Liberty ship bound for the United States. The voyage across the Atlantic took 2 weeks, during which rumors spread among the prisoners like wildfire. Some feared they would be executed upon arrival. Others whispered about forced labor in American mines. Hans Becker, a former tank commander from Bavaria, insisted they would be used as human shields in the Pacific campaign against Japan. The reality proved far more surprising. When the ship docked in New York Harbor, Klaus caught his first glimpse of the Statue of Liberty through the porthole. The irony was not lost on him, a symbol of freedom welcoming prisoners of war. American guards processed them efficiently, but without the brutality many had expected based on their treatment of Soviet prisoners. Klaus was eventually transferred to Camp Aliceville in Alabama, one of over 500 POW camps scattered across America. The journey south by train revealed a landscape of unimaginable abundance. Endless farmlands stretched to the horizon, cities bustled with activity, and factories churned out goods without fear of bombing raids. This was not the desperate, starving nation that German propaganda had portrayed. Upon arrival at Camp Aliceville, Klaus was assigned to Compound B, which housed approximately 1,000 German prisoners. The barracks were clean, heated, and equipped with electric lighting, luxuries many German civilians had lost during the war's final years. Each prisoner received 3 meals daily, medical care, and recreational facilities that seemed almost surreal. The camp's commanding officer, Colonel James Patterson, addressed the new arrivals through an interpreter. He explained that as long as they followed camp rules and the Geneva Convention, they would be treated with dignity and respect. Klaus exchanged glances with his fellow prisoners, many wearing expressions of disbelief. What truly shocked them, however, came during their first week at the camp. After evening roll call, guards announced that entertainment would be provided in the camp's newly constructed recreation hall. Klaus assumed it might be a military propaganda film or educational lecture. Instead, as he filed into the building with hundreds of other prisoners, he saw something that would forever change his perception of America and its people. The recreation hall buzzed with nervous energy as nearly 800 German prisoners settled into wooden chairs facing a large white screen. Klaus had never been inside a movie theater. Such frivolities had been rare luxuries in wartime Germany. The American guards seemed almost as curious as the prisoners, watching their reactions with bemused interest. Sergeant William McKay, the camp's morale officer, stood before the crowd and announced in careful German that they would be watching an American film called Going My Way, starring Bing Crosby. Klaus had never heard of Bing Crosby, but the name itself sounded impossibly American, like something from a dime novel. As the lights dimmed and the projector whirred to life, Klaus felt his breath catch. The screen flickered, then burst into brilliant black and white images accompanied by orchestral music that filled the hall. For many prisoners, this was their first exposure to Hollywood's magic, and the technological marvel alone left them speechless. The film told the story of Father Chuck O'Malley, a young Catholic priest who brings modern methods and music to a struggling New York parish. Klaus watched in fascination as Bing Crosby's character sang, joked, and connected with people from all walks of life. The America portrayed on screen bore no resemblance to the decadent, Jewish-controlled wasteland described in Nazi propaganda. Hans Becker, sitting beside Klaus, leaned over and whispered, "They have Negro singers performing alongside whites." Indeed, the film featured scenes of integrated performances that challenged everything they had been taught about American racial policies. The casual interaction between different ethnic groups seemed natural and unforced. What struck Klaus most profoundly was the film's portrayal of religion and community. Father O'Malley worked tirelessly to save his parish and help troubled youth, embodying values that resonated deeply with Klaus's own Catholic upbringing. The priest's compassion and humor reminded him of Father Heinrich back in his Bavarian village, who had secretly counseled against Nazi extremism. During intermission, the hall erupted in animated discussions. Some prisoners dismissed the film as American propaganda designed to soften their resistance. Others, like Klaus, found themselves genuinely moved by the story's message of redemption and human dignity. Werner Hoffmann, a former SS officer, stormed out midway through the screening, declaring it degenerate Jewish cinema. According to records from the National Archives, referenced in historian Robert Billinger's book Nazi POWs in the Heartland, Camp Aliceville showed films twice weekly as part of a broader re-education program designed to expose German prisoners to American democratic values and culture. When the lights came up after the final scene, Klaus noticed tears in several prisoners' eyes. The experience had been overwhelming, not just the film itself, but the realization that their captors considered them worthy of entertainment and cultural enrichment. In German camps, enemy prisoners received barely enough food to survive, let alone recreational activities. The questions began immediately. How could Americans afford such elaborate productions during wartime? Why would they waste resources on entertainment when they could be building weapons? Most puzzling of all, why were they sharing this cultural treasure with their enemies? Sergeant McKay patiently answered what questions he could through the interpreter. He explained that Hollywood had continued producing films throughout the war, both for domestic morale and international distribution. The industry saw cinema as a powerful tool for promoting American values worldwide. As Klaus walked back to his barracks under the Alabama stars, he carried with him images that would haunt his dreams. Father O'Malley's gentle smile, the bustling streets of New York, and the casual prosperity that seemed to permeate every frame. For the first time since his capture, he began to question not just the war's outcome, but everything he had believed about the enemy. The morning after the first film screening, Camp Aliceville hummed with unprecedented activity. Klaus observed his fellow prisoners huddled in small groups, speaking in hushed tones about what they had witnessed. The camp's Nazi loyalists, led by Werner Hoffmann and his circle of SS veterans, moved systematically through the barracks, attempting to counter what they called American psychological warfare. Hoffmann cornered Klaus near the mess hall, his pale eyes burning with familiar fanaticism. "They are trying to poison our minds with their decadent films," he hissed. "This is exactly what the Führer warned us about. Jewish Hollywood corrupting German souls with false promises of prosperity and racial mixing." Klaus nodded non-committally, but privately he struggled with contradictions. If Hollywood was controlled by Jews intent on destroying German culture, why did Going My Way celebrate Christian values so powerfully? Why did the story emphasize community service, sacrifice, and moral virtue, ideals that resonated with his own upbringing? The camp's German-speaking psychiatrist, Dr. Margaret Hoffmann, herself a refugee from Nazi persecution, began conducting informal interviews with prisoners about their reactions to the films. Her reports, later archived at the University of Alabama, revealed the deep psychological impact of this cultural exposure on men who had been isolated from outside perspectives for years. Dr. Hoffman noted that younger prisoners like Klaus showed more openness to American cultural products, while older veterans and ideological hardliners maintained fierce resistance. The films created what she termed cognitive dissonance, forcing prisoners to reconcile their preconceived notions with contradictory evidence presented through entertainment. The second week brought The Best Years of Our Lives, a film about American veterans returning from the war. Klaus watched in stunned silence as the story unfolded, showing disabled veterans struggling with readjustment, economic uncertainty, and personal relationships. This was not the triumphant propaganda he expected, but a nuanced examination of war's psychological costs. Harold Russell, who had lost both hands in the war, gave a performance that left many German prisoners visibly shaken. Klaus had been taught that Americans were soft, unwilling to sacrifice for their beliefs. Yet here was a man who had given his hands for his country, portrayed with dignity and respect, rather than as a victim to be pitied. The film's treatment of working-class characters particularly impressed former Wehrmacht enlisted men. Frederick March's character, a banker struggling with civilian life, showed vulnerability and doubt rather than the superhuman confidence attributed to American leaders in Nazi propaganda. These were recognizable human beings, not the caricatures painted by Joseph Goebbels. After this screening, the discussions grew more heated. Some prisoners began openly questioning Nazi teachings about American society. Otto Kramer, a former Wehrmacht sergeant, observed, "If Americans are so weak and decadent, how did they build such weapons, such cities, such films? How did they cross an ocean to defeat us?" The Nazi loyalists responded with increasing desperation. They organized secret meetings, distributed crude propaganda leaflets, and threatened prisoners who showed too much enthusiasm for American culture. Hoffman warned that names were being recorded for future retribution when Germany rose again. Colonel Patterson, aware of these tensions, made a calculated decision. Rather than suppress the Nazi faction directly, he increased the film schedule to 3 times weekly and added educational documentaries about American history and government. He understood that ideas once planted would grow organically if given proper nurturing. The strategy proved brilliant. Each new film provided fresh ammunition for moderate prisoners to challenge extremist interpretations. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington demonstrated democratic principles in action. The Grapes of Wrath showed American filmmakers' willingness to criticize their own society's failures, contradicting claims about propaganda control. Klaus found himself appointed as an informal translator, helping other prisoners understand cultural references and American slang. The role gave him access to guards and camp administrators, providing insights into American thinking that gradually transformed his worldview. He began to see his captors not as enemies, but as complex individuals with their own hopes, fears, and moral struggles. By autumn of 1945, Camp Aliceville had become a microcosm of post-war Germany's ideological struggle. The regular film screenings had created 2 distinct factions among the prisoners: those increasingly open to American culture and democratic ideals, and hardcore Nazis determined to maintain ideological purity despite defeat. Klaus found himself caught between these worlds when he was selected for the camp's new work detail program. Along with 200 other prisoners, he was assigned to help local farmers with their cotton harvest, a task that would bring him into direct contact with American civilians for the first time since his capture. The bus ride to the Patterson farm took 30 minutes through Alabama's rolling countryside. Klaus pressed his face to the window, marveling at the well-maintained roads, prosperous-looking farmhouses, and mechanized agriculture that stretched to the horizon. The abundance was staggering compared to war-ravaged Europe. Henry Patterson, a weathered man in his 50s, greeted the German work detail with cautious courtesy. His eldest son had been killed at Normandy, and Klaus could see the pain in the farmer's eyes when he looked at the prisoners' uniforms. Yet Patterson treated them fairly, providing adequate breaks, clean water, and even sharing his wife's homemade biscuits during lunch. Working alongside American farmhands, Klaus experienced genuine culture shock. The casual egalitarianism amazed him. White and black workers laboring side by side, joking and sharing stories without the rigid racial hierarchies he had been taught to expect. When a young black worker named Samuel offered to teach Klaus proper cotton-picking technique, the gesture of friendship left the German speechless. These daily interactions gradually humanized both sides. Patterson learned that Klaus had grown up on a small farm in Bavaria and shared similar concerns about weather, crop yields, and animal husbandry. Their broken conversations in mixed German and English revealed common ground that transcended national boundaries. Back at camp, however, Werner Hoffmann's influence was growing more dangerous. The SS veteran had organized what he called the Committee for German Honor, which monitored prisoners' loyalty and punished those deemed contaminated by American influence. Klaus returned from work one evening to find his bunk searched and his few personal possessions scattered. Hoffmann confronted him directly that night. "You're becoming too friendly with the Americans," he warned. "Remember, this war is not over. Germany will rise again, and we'll remember who remained loyal and who betrayed their fatherland for enemy comfort." The threat carried real weight. Several prisoners had been severely beaten for expressing admiration for American films or questioning Nazi ideology. Hans Becker, Klaus's friend from the ship crossing, sported a black eye after suggesting that perhaps Germany had been wrong about American capabilities. The situation reached a crisis point during a screening of Casablanca. The film's anti-Nazi message, embodied in the character of Victor Laszlo and the famous La Marseillaise scene, sent Hoffmann's faction into a rage. They disrupted the showing by singing Nazi songs and making threats against prisoners who continued watching. Colonel Patterson responded decisively the next morning. He separated the most hardcore Nazi sympathizers into a special compound, effectively creating two camps within the larger facility. The move was controversial. Some American officials worried about violating Geneva Convention provisions, but it was necessary to prevent violence. With the Nazi hardliners isolated, the atmosphere in the main compound changed dramatically. Prisoners felt safer expressing doubts about their former beliefs and asking questions about American society. Dr. Hoffmann's therapeutic sessions revealed remarkable psychological transformations occurring through exposure to American culture and values. Klaus volunteered to help organize a prisoner discussion group that met after film screenings. The informal gatherings, held in the recreation hall, became forums for processing the complex emotions stirred by Hollywood productions. Former soldiers who had blindly followed orders began thinking critically about authority, propaganda, and personal responsibility. The group's conversations were recorded by American intelligence officers interested in understanding how German POWs might be successfully integrated into post-war democratic society. These transcripts, now housed in the National Archives, provide remarkable insights into the psychological processes involved in ideological transformation. As 1945 drew to a close, Klaus realized he was no longer the same person who had surrendered in the French mud 7 months earlier. The films, the work details, and the daily interactions with Americans had fundamentally altered his understanding of the world. He still felt loyalty to Germany, but it was a different kind of patriotism, one based on culture and heritage rather than racial superiority and military conquest. The approach of Christmas 1945 brought unexpected emotional challenges to Camp Aliceville's German prisoners. Many had not celebrated the holiday with their families for years, and the prospect of spending it in enemy captivity deepened their homesickness. Klaus found himself thinking constantly of his mother's Christmas stolen and his father's annual reading of the Nativity story. Colonel Patterson, demonstrating remarkable cultural sensitivity, announced that the camp would observe traditional German Christmas customs alongside American ones. The recreation hall was decorated with evergreen boughs and handcrafted ornaments made by prisoners in the camp's woodworking shop. Most surprising of all, the film schedule would feature Christmas movies from Hollywood's golden age. The first screening was It's a Wonderful Life, Frank Capra's masterpiece about George Bailey's journey from despair to renewed hope. Klaus had never encountered anything like Jimmy Stewart's portrayal of an ordinary man discovering his life's profound meaning through service to others. The film's message that every person matters, regardless of social status or material success, directly contradicted Nazi ideology about racial hierarchies and national destiny. During the famous bridge scene, where George contemplates suicide before Clarence the Angel intervenes, Klaus heard quiet sobbing throughout the theater. Many prisoners had experienced similar moments of despair during the war's final months, questioning whether their sacrifices had any meaning. Stewart's emotional breakdown resonated with men who had seen their world collapse around them. The film's portrayal of small-town American life particularly fascinated the German audience. Bedford Falls represented everything they had been taught to despise about democratic society: racial integration, economic cooperation, and individual freedom prioritized over state control. Yet the community's warmth and mutual support reminded many prisoners of their own villages before Nazi ideology poisoned social relationships. Hans Becker, still nursing injuries from his confrontation with Nazi loyalists, whispered to Klaus during intermission, "This is what we lost when we followed the Führer. We forgot that ordinary people matter more than grand political schemes." The second Christmas film proved even more transformative. Miracle on 34th Street challenged prisoners' understanding of American materialism and religious faith. The story of Kris Kringle working at Macy's department store initially seemed to confirm Nazi stereotypes about American commercial excess. However, the film's deeper message about believing in goodness despite cynicism struck many viewers as profoundly spiritual. Edmund Gwen's portrayal of Santa Claus as a gentle, wise man who brought joy to children regardless of their economic circumstances moved even hardened veterans. The courtroom scenes, where lawyers defended the existence of Santa Claus using legal precedent and democratic principles, demonstrated how American institutions could protect minority viewpoints and individual beliefs. Klaus was particularly struck by the film's treatment of skepticism and faith. Judge Henry Harper's decision to believe in Santa Claus represented a leap of faith that paralleled the psychological journey many prisoners were experiencing. Could they believe in the possibility of redemption and positive change despite their recent history? The Christmas celebrations themselves proved equally significant. American guards organized a gift exchange where prisoners could craft presents for each other using materials provided by the camp administration. Klaus carved a small wooden cross for Hans Becker, who had begun questioning his atheistic beliefs after years of Nazi indoctrination. Local churches, initially hesitant to minister to enemy prisoners, gradually began visiting the camp to provide spiritual counseling. Father Michael O'Brien, a Catholic priest whose own son had died in the Pacific Theater, overcame his personal grief to offer Mass for German Catholics like Klaus. These services, conducted in German with English hymns, created powerful moments of shared humanity across enemy lines. The Christmas Eve screening was Going My Way, a return to the film that had started many prisoners' cultural awakening. Watching it again, Klaus noticed details he had missed during his first viewing. Bing Crosby's Father O'Malley embodied the same compassionate Christianity that Father Heinrich had represented back home before the Nazis made church attendance politically dangerous. According to documents archived at the Alabama Department of Archives and History, referenced in James Moore's comprehensive study, Alabama POW Camps During World War II, the Christmas 1945 celebrations marked a turning point in many prisoners' psychological rehabilitation. As 1946 began, Klaus realized that Hollywood films had accomplished what years of Nazi propaganda had failed to do. They had shown him a vision of society worth believing in and working toward. The movies had not converted him to American nationalism, but they had opened his mind to universal human values that transcended national boundaries. The transformation was not complete, nor was it universal among the prisoners. But for men like Klaus, the combination of humane treatment, cultural exposure, and genuine human contact had planted seeds of democratic thinking that would influence their entire post-war lives. Spring 1946 brought new challenges to Camp Aliceville as news from occupied Germany filtered through official channels and prisoner mail. The reports painted a devastating picture: cities reduced to rubble, widespread hunger, and a civilian population struggling to survive under Allied occupation. Klaus received his first letter from home in 8 months, learning that his village had been overrun by Soviet forces and his family evacuated to a refugee camp near Munich. The contrast between his comfortable situation in Alabama and his family's suffering created profound guilt. While he watched Hollywood films and worked on prosperous American farms, his loved ones faced starvation and homelessness. This emotional turmoil was shared by thousands of German POWs across America, creating what camp psychiatrists termed survivor's syndrome. Werner Hoffmann, now confined to the special compound with other Nazi loyalists, exploited these feelings through smuggled messages and underground networks. His propaganda emphasized American hypocrisy, treating enemy prisoners better than many American citizens while German civilians starved. Some prisoners began questioning whether the films were indeed sophisticated psychological warfare designed to break their resistance. Colonel Patterson, aware of these tensions, made a controversial decision to show documentaries about the liberation of Nazi concentration camps alongside the regular entertainment programming. The footage from Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, and Auschwitz was devastating in its impact, forcing prisoners to confront the reality of what their government had done in their name. Klaus watched the documentary footage in stunned silence, his hands trembling as images of skeletal prisoners and mass graves filled the screen. Like many Wehrmacht soldiers, he had heard rumors about concentration camps, but dismissed them as enemy propaganda or exaggerated stories. The visual evidence was undeniable and overwhelming. The screening triggered violent reactions throughout the camp. Some prisoners broke down completely, unable to reconcile their service to the Nazi state with these horrific revelations. Others, like Hoffmann's followers, denounced the footage as fabricated Hollywood propaganda created to justify Allied war crimes against German civilians. Dr. Hoffmann worked overtime conducting crisis counseling sessions with prisoners struggling to process their complicity in war crimes. Her notes, later published in psychiatric journals, documented the psychological mechanisms people use to cope with moral injury and collective guilt. Many prisoners experienced what she termed ideological whiplash, rapid shifts between denial, anger, and acceptance. Klaus found himself appointed to a prisoner committee tasked with responding to the documentary evidence. The committee's discussions were heated and sometimes violent, reflecting the broader struggle within German society to confront Nazi crimes. Some members argued that individual soldiers bore no responsibility for concentration camps they knew nothing about. Others, including Klaus, began accepting that their military service had enabled genocide. The committee's final report, submitted to camp authorities in May 1946, acknowledged Nazi war crimes while maintaining that most Wehrmacht soldiers had served honorably within their limited knowledge and options. This compromise satisfied neither the hardline deniers nor those demanding full acceptance of collective guilt, but it represented a crucial step toward confronting historical reality. Hollywood films took on new meaning after the concentration camp documentaries. Movies like The Best Years of Our Lives now seemed less like propaganda and more like honest examinations of war's psychological costs on all participants. Klaus began understanding that American cinema's complexity, its willingness to show both national strengths and weaknesses, reflected a democratic society's capacity for self-reflection. The work detail program expanded during this period, bringing Klaus into closer contact with American families affected by the war. The Patterson family, despite losing their son in Europe, gradually accepted Klaus as almost a member of their household. Mrs. Patterson taught him English idioms while he helped with farm chores, creating bonds that transcended national enemy status. These personal relationships provided context for understanding American motivations in both war and peace. The Pattersons had not fought Germany out of hatred for German people, but from belief in democratic principles and opposition to Nazi aggression. Their treatment of Klaus demonstrated American ideals in practice, the capacity to separate individuals from their government's actions. According to research conducted by historian Arnold Kramer for his book Nazi Prisoners of War in America, over 90% of German POWs returned home with significantly altered political views, largely due to their exposure to American democratic culture and institutions. As summer approached, Klaus began preparing mentally for eventual repatriation to Germany. The process would likely take months, but he knew his American captivity was temporary. The question that haunted him was whether the democratic ideals he had encountered in Alabama could take root in post-war Germany's devastated soil. The films had shown him visions of what human society could become when guided by compassion, justice, and individual dignity rather than racial hatred and authoritarian control. Whether those visions could survive the harsh realities of occupied Germany remained to be seen. By late 1946, rumors of repatriation dominated conversations throughout Camp Aliceville. The war had been over for more than a year, and international pressure was mounting for the return of German prisoners to their homeland. Klaus felt conflicted about the prospect. Part of him desperately wanted to reunite with his family, while another part dreaded leaving the relative security and intellectual freedom he had discovered in Alabama. The camp's film program continued with increased intensity, as if American administrators recognized they had limited time to complete their unofficial re-education mission. The selections became more sophisticated, including films that directly addressed themes of democracy, individual responsibility, and social reconstruction. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington was followed by The Oxbow Incident, a powerful meditation on mob justice and the rule of law. Klaus had been selected for advanced English classes taught by Professor Elizabeth Morrison from the University of Alabama. The classes used American films as teaching tools, analyzing dialogue, cultural references, and social themes while improving language skills. Professor Morrison's approach was subtle but effective. She never directly criticized Nazi ideology, instead allowing American democratic values to speak for themselves through cinematic narratives. During one particularly memorable session analyzing To Kill a Mockingbird, which had just been released, Professor Morrison led discussions about prejudice, moral courage, and standing up for unpopular principles. Klaus found parallels between Atticus Finch's defense of Tom Robinson and Father Heinrich's quiet resistance to Nazi anti-Semitism back home. Both men had risked social ostracism to uphold moral principles. The most significant development came when Klaus was invited to participate in a special program designed to train German POWs for leadership roles in post-war reconstruction. The program, classified at the time, but later revealed through declassified documents, aimed to identify prisoners who had genuinely embraced democratic values and could serve as positive influences in occupied Germany. Klaus's selection for this program reflected his transformation from a committed Nazi soldier to a thoughtful advocate for democratic principles. His fluent English, leadership qualities among fellow prisoners, and evident psychological rehabilitation made him an ideal candidate for the American investment in Germany's democratic future. The training program included intensive study of American government, economics, and social institutions. But the most powerful component remained the film screenings, now accompanied by detailed discussions led by political scientists and historians. Movies like All the King's Men explored the dangers of demagoguery and corruption in democratic systems, while Gentleman's Agreement examined anti-Semitism in American society. These films taught Klaus that democracy was not perfect. It required constant vigilance and active participation to prevent abuse. American cinema's willingness to criticize American society impressed him more than any propaganda about American superiority could have. This self-critical capacity seemed to be democracy's greatest strength and most important safeguard. Hans Becker, who had also been selected for the leadership program, struggled more with the psychological transition. During one late-night conversation in their barracks, he confided to Klaus, "Sometimes I wonder if we're betraying our comrades who died for Germany by accepting American ideas so completely." Klaus had wrestled with similar doubts, but his answer reflected months of careful thinking. "We're not betraying Germany by learning from our enemies. We're preparing to build a better Germany that honors our people's best traditions while rejecting the poison that led to our destruction." The conversation was overheard by several other prisoners, sparking broader discussions about post-war German identity. Many struggled with reconciling their love for German culture and history with their growing rejection of Nazi ideology. The films had shown them that patriotism could be compatible with international cooperation and human rights, concepts that seemed contradictory under Nazi teaching. As preparation for repatriation intensified, Klaus received devastating news from home. His father had died during the harsh winter of 1945 to 46, and his mother was seriously ill in a displaced persons camp. The Red Cross letter painted a grim picture of post-war conditions that contrasted sharply with his comfortable life in Alabama. The news forced Klaus to confront the reality that his American experience, however transformative, was temporary. He would soon return to a devastated homeland where survival took precedence over philosophical contemplation. The democratic ideals he had embraced would be tested against hunger, homelessness, and the daily struggle to rebuild from ruins. Colonel Patterson, recognizing Klaus's distress, arranged a final meeting to discuss his plans for the future. The colonel expressed confidence that men like Klaus could help Germany transition to democracy, but acknowledged the enormous challenges they would face. He provided Klaus with letters of recommendation and contact information for American officials working in occupied Germany. As 1947 began, Klaus prepared for the most difficult transition of his life, returning home as a fundamentally changed person to a fundamentally changed country. The Hollywood films that had opened his mind to democratic possibilities would soon be tested against the harsh realities of post-war reconstruction. March 1947 brought the long-awaited announcement that Klaus's group would be among the first German POWs repatriated from American camps. The news sparked mixed emotions throughout Camp Aliceville, excitement about reuniting with families tempered by anxiety about returning to an unknown and devastated homeland. Klaus packed his few belongings, including a small collection of American books and a letter of recommendation from Colonel Patterson. The journey home began with a train ride to New York, retracing the route Klaus had taken as a defeated prisoner nearly 2 years earlier. But this time, he observed America with educated eyes, recognizing the democratic institutions and cultural values he had studied through Hollywood films. The bustling cities, prosperous farms, and confident citizens represented more than enemy territory. They embodied possibilities for Germany's future. At the Brooklyn Navy Yard, Klaus joined 800 other repatriated prisoners aboard the USS General Black, a former troop transport converted for peacetime use. The ship's conditions were Spartan compared to his Alabama barracks, but Klaus used the 2-week voyage to prepare mentally for his return. He organized English conversation groups and led discussions about democratic governance, drawing on the films and training he had received. The sight of Bremen's devastated harbor in April 1947 shocked Klaus, despite his preparation. The once proud Hanseatic city lay in ruins, its medieval architecture replaced by mountains of rubble and hastily constructed refugee shelters. British occupation forces efficiently processed the returning prisoners, but the bureaucratic reception felt cold after the personal relationships Klaus had developed with American guards and administrators. Klaus's journey to Munich revealed the full extent of Germany's destruction. Cities he remembered as architectural jewels had been reduced to skeletal remains by Allied bombing. Refugees crowded into temporary camps, struggling to survive on meager rations while searching for missing relatives. The contrast with Alabama's abundance was overwhelming and depressing. Reuniting with his mother in a displaced persons camp outside Munich proved emotionally devastating. She had aged 20 years in the 2 years since he had last seen her, worn down by hunger, cold, and the psychological trauma of losing her home and husband. Klaus barely recognized the strong woman who had raised him on their Bavarian farm. The practical challenges of post-war survival initially overwhelmed Klaus's democratic ideals. Finding adequate shelter, securing food rations, and locating employment took precedence over political philosophy. The black market thrived while legal institutions struggled to establish authority, creating conditions that favored pragmatism over principle. However, Klaus gradually found opportunities to apply his American training. He volunteered with church groups helping refugees, drawing on organizational skills learned in Alabama's work detail program. His fluent English made him valuable to American occupation authorities seeking German civilians who could serve as intermediaries with local populations. Klaus's first major opportunity came when he was hired as a translator for the U.S. Information Service office in Munich. The position involved distributing American publications, organizing cultural events, and facilitating communication between occupation forces and German civilians. His understanding of both cultures, gained through his POW experience, made him exceptionally effective in this role. The most significant aspect of his new job involved organizing film screenings for German civilians, essentially continuing the program that had transformed his own worldview. Klaus arranged showings of It's a Wonderful Life, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and other films that had influenced his thinking during captivity. The German audience's reactions mirrored his own journey from skepticism to appreciation. According to documents from the U.S. National Security Archive, referenced in historian Jessica Genau-Hecht's study, Transmission Impossible: American Journalism as Cultural Diplomacy in Post-War Germany, former POWs like Klaus played crucial roles in Germany's democratization process during the early occupation period. By 1949, Klaus had married a war widow with 2 young children and established a small business importing American films for German theaters. His success reflected both his practical skills and his deep understanding of American culture gained through his imprisonment. The Hollywood movies that had once seemed like enemy propaganda now provided his livelihood. Klaus often reflected on the irony that his capture and imprisonment had ultimately liberated him from Nazi ideology and opened pathways to a better life. The films screened at Camp Aliceville had done more than entertain. They had demonstrated alternative ways of organizing society based on individual dignity, democratic participation, and cultural tolerance. In 1951, Klaus received an invitation to return to Alabama for the wedding of Henry Patterson's daughter. The trip, his first return to America since repatriation, felt like a homecoming. He marveled at how the experience of watching Hollywood films as a prisoner of war had fundamentally altered the trajectory of his life and contributed to Germany's post-war transformation. Klaus Müller's story exemplifies how cultural exchange, even under circumstances of military defeat, could serve as a bridge between former enemies and a foundation for building more humane societies. The German POWs, who couldn't believe they were watching Hollywood films in American camps, discovered that cinema could be a powerful force for human understanding and democratic enlightenment.